There's a certain kind of quiet that settles over a town like Port Blossom, Maine, once the last of the summer tourists have packed up and gone home. It's a heavy quiet, thick with the smell of salt and low tide, and for 40 years it was the soundtrack to my life. I'm Arthur Callahan, art to my friends, and for most of those years I was a welder down at the shipyard. My hands, even now, look like a roadmap of every ship I ever helped build, scarred, calloused, and stiff in the morning chill. But they were good hands, honest hands. They built a life for my wife, Eleanor, and our son, Kevin. After Eleanor passed 5 years ago, that life got a whole lot quieter. The silence in our little house, the one I framed myself on a quarter-acre lot overlooking the bay, became a living thing. Sometimes it was peaceful. Other times, it was a weight on my chest. Most of my days followed a simple rhythm: coffee at dawn, watching the lobster boats head out, a few hours in the garden, trying to coax tomatoes out of the stubborn Maine soil, lunch, a nap, and maybe a walk down to the docks to talk with the old-timers. But that simple rhythm was always humming with a low-grade anxiety, a quiet strain that had one name: Kevin. My son was 39 years old, a man by every definition except the one that mattered most. He lived 2 hours away in Portland with his wife, Jenna, in a life that seemed to be built on a foundation of sand, and I was the fool who kept delivering the bags to shore it up. Just last week, he'd called. The conversations always started the same way: cheerful, full of big talk about a new opportunity he was chasing. He was in marketing, he said, though what he marketed was a mystery to me. "Dad, hey, listen, things are about to take off. I mean, really take off," he'd said, his voice slick with a kind of rehearsed optimism. But Jenna's car just, well, it gave up the ghost. The transmission is shot. We're in a real bind, and you know how she needs it for her clients. I didn't know who her clients were either. I pictured her typing on a laptop in a coffee shop, wearing clothes that cost more than my property taxes. I knew it was a lie. Not the car part, maybe, but the reason. It was never just a transmission. It was a credit card bill, a late payment on their fancy apartment, another one of Jenna's weekend trips with her friends. But he was my son, my only kid. Eleanor, God rest her soul, she saw it clearly. "Art, you're not helping him," she'd say, her voice gentle but firm as shipyard steel. "You're holding him up. A man who never feels his own weight will never learn to stand." I'd always wave it off, telling her he just needed a little more time to find his feet. Now, standing alone in the kitchen, I transferred $2,000 money from the fund Eleanor, and I had earmarked for a new roof and felt a familiar pang of guilt. I looked over at the photo of her on the mantelpiece, her smile so full of life, and I felt like I was letting her down all over again. The quiet of the house suddenly felt less like peace and more like judgment. The guilt from that phone call lingered for a couple of days, a sour taste in the back of my throat. The best way I knew to chase away bad feelings was with hard work, to lose myself in a problem I could actually solve. My old 1995 Ford F-150, a truck I'd bought brand new the year Kevin got his driver's license, was making a funny rattling noise. It was my Saturday project. The garage was my sanctuary, smelling of gasoline, old oil, and sawdust. It was the one place where everything made sense. A stripped bolt had a solution. A worn-out belt could be replaced. The world was logical in here. I had the hood propped open, my trouble light casting a yellow glow on the engine block, and I was trying to get a wrench on a stubborn alternator bolt. That's when it happened. 1 second, I was leaning over the fender, putting my shoulder into it, the familiar strain in my back, a dull, comforting ache. The next, the wrench in my hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor, the sound echoing strangely, as if it were coming from the end of a long tunnel. I tried to straighten up, but a wave of dizziness so powerful it felt like the whole garage was tilting on its side, washed over me. The rows of tools on my pegboard wall blurred into a smear of color. I reached out a hand to steady myself against the truck, but my arm wouldn't obey. It was like a wire had been cut somewhere between my brain and my limb. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the confusion. I opened my mouth to call out, to shout for help, though I wasn't sure who I was shouting for. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, was probably the only one within earshot, but the word help came out as a garbled, guttural sound, a stranger's voice in my own throat. My left leg gave way, and I crumpled, my shoulder hitting the side of the truck with a dull thud before I slid down to the greasy floor. The left side of my face was pressed against the cold concrete, the smell of motor oil filling my nostrils. The world was sideways. Through the open garage door, I could see the sky, a brilliant, indifferent blue. My mind was a storm of disconnected thoughts. Eleanor, the roof fund, a loose wire, Kevin. I tried to think of my son's name, to hold on to it, but it kept slipping away from me like a wet bar of soap. I was trapped inside a body that had suddenly become a prison. I could hear everything: a dog barking down the street, the distant cry of a seagull, the hum of the beer fridge in the corner, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only lie there, watching a small river of spilled antifreeze creep slowly across the floor towards me. How long was I there? Minutes? An hour? Time had lost all meaning. Then, a new sound, a voice, cutting through the fog. Arthur, you in there? I saw your door was wide open. It was Mrs. Gable. I saw her blurry figure appear in the bright rectangle of the doorway, her hand held up to shield her eyes from the Sunday I tried to groan, to make any sound to let her know I was there. Her shape sharpened as she stepped into the garage, and then a gasp. Oh dear God, Arthur. Her footsteps rushed toward me, and then her face was above mine, full of terror and pity. The next part was a blur of disconnected images, her voice on the phone, sharp and panicked. The rising wail of a siren, getting closer and closer, until it was deafening. Strange faces in dark uniforms, their voices calm and professional, but sounding a million miles away, a prick in my arm. The feeling of being lifted, the ceiling of my own garage spinning above me. Then the bright blue sky, the ambulance doors closing, and finally, a deep, silent, all-consuming darkness. The engine had stopped. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It seeped back in fragments, like light filtering through a thick fog. The first thing I was aware of was a rhythmic, mechanical whoosh, a sound that was both inside me and outside of me, pushing air into my lungs with a gentle, insistent pressure. With it came a steady, high-pitched beep, 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 a metronome counting out the seconds of a life I wasn't sure was still mine. Before I could see or think, I could feel. There was a dull, pounding ache behind my eyes, and a hideous, scraping dryness in my throat, the source of which was a plastic tube that felt as wide as a garden hose. My body was a dead weight, heavy and unresponsive, pinned to a mattress that was too soft and too foreign to be my own. When I finally managed to force my eyelids open, the world was a painful, overexposed photograph. Everything was white. The ceiling tiles, the thin blanket covering me, the harsh fluorescent light that made me want to slam my eyes shut again. The white fog wasn't just in my head, it was the room itself. Shapes moved at the edge of my vision, blurry figures in pale blue scrubs who swam in and out of focus. Their voices were a low murmur, the words indistinct, like a radio playing in another room. I was floating, untethered from reality, a ghost in a machine. Panic, a hot and suffocating wave, began to rise in my chest. I tried to lift my hand, to grab the monstrous tube in my throat and rip it out, but my arm felt like it was cast in lead. I was screaming inside, a silent, primal roar of pure terror, but my body wouldn't obey. I was a prisoner, locked inside my own skull. Time became a meaningless loop. There was no day or night, only the shifting of shadows in the white room and the changing faces of the nurses. One would come and shine a tiny light in my eyes. Another would adjust the plastic bag of clear liquid hanging by my bed. They'd speak to me in calm, soothing tones, words I couldn't quite catch. Vitals are stable. He's responding. Just rest, Mr. Callahan. Rest. How could I rest in this waking nightmare? Each time a nurse entered, a flicker of desperate hope ignited in me. I'd try to focus my eyes, searching for a familiar face, for my son, for Kevin. Each time, it was just another kind stranger in scrubs, another wave of disappointment that left me feeling colder and more alone than before. I don't know how many of these cycles I went through. 2 days, 5, a week. It felt like an eternity. Then, one afternoon, the fog began to thin. The beeping of the machines started to sound less like a single monotonous note and more like a collection of different rhythms. The blurry shape of a nurse leaning over me sharpened into the face of a young woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. She was speaking, and for the first time I could understand her. Mr. Callahan? Art, can you hear me? You're in Port Blossom General. You had a pretty serious stroke. We had to intubate you, but your breathing is much stronger now. We're going to try taking the tube out today. The procedure was uncomfortable, but the moment that plastic was pulled from my raw throat, the rush of cool, sterile air into my own lungs was the most glorious feeling I'd ever known. My voice was a dry, rasping whisper, but it was mine. "Thank you," I managed to croak. The nurse gave my arm a reassuring squeeze. "You're a fighter, Art." She bustled around, checking the monitors, and for the first time, I could properly see my surroundings. Wires taped to my chest, an IV needle in the back of my hand, the stark, impersonal furniture of an intensive care unit, and in the corner, a single vinyl visitor's chair. It was empty. My eyes scanned the small room, searching for any sign that I hadn't been completely alone through this ordeal. There were no flowers on the windowsill, no cards tucked into the side of the monitor, no half-read newspaper or magazine left on the bedside table. There was nothing. Just the sterile, white efficiency of the hospital. The physical panic of being trapped in my body began to recede, but it was replaced by something far worse. A cold, heavy dread that settled deep in my gut. My breathing was my own again, but every breath I took felt hollow. The white fog in my mind had cleared, only to reveal a stark and terrifying truth. I was alone, utterly alone. The hours after the breathing tube came out were a strange mix of relief and rising panic. Every breath was a victory, but the empty chair in the corner of the room seemed to grow larger, casting a longer shadow with each passing minute. The nurse with the kind eyes, a young woman named Sarah, came in to check my vitals. My voice was still a fragile, scratchy thing, but I had to know. "My son," I rasped, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "Kevin Callahan. Has he been here?" A supple change came over her face. It was almost imperceptible, a professional mask sliding into place over her genuine warmth. It was a look of practiced pity. "Art, our main priority has been getting you stable and breathing on your own," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she adjusted my foredrip. "You've been through a tremendous ordeal. The most important thing you can do right now is focus on your rest." It wasn't a no, but it wasn't a yes either. It was a wall, built of polite, professional words. It was the first obstacle. I let it go for a little while. I told myself there were a dozen reasonable explanations. Kevin lived 2 hours away. Maybe he'd come by when I was unconscious. Maybe work had him tied up, a big project he couldn't get out of. He had to be worried sick. He had to be. The next morning, a different nurse came in on the day shift, a cheerful, bustling man named Marco. I tried again, my voice a little stronger this time. "I need to get a message to my son Kevin. Can you tell me if he's left a number, if he's called?" Marco gave me a bright, unbothered smile. "We contacted the emergency number we have on your file the moment you were admitted, Mr. Callahan. All the notifications have been sent out," he said while flawlessly changing my saline bag. Again, not an answer. He was telling me about a protocol, a box that had been checked on a form somewhere. He wasn't telling me if my son cared that I was here. The frustration was a slow burn, a coiling knot in my stomach. I felt like I was trying to punch my way through pillows. The final attempt came that afternoon, when the doctor in charge of my case came on her rounds. She was a tall, no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Dr. Evans. She spoke with a crisp, efficient air, explaining the results of my latest scans and the plan for my recovery. She was direct, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, she would give me a straight answer. After she finished her medical report, I looked her square in the eye. "Doctor," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Forget the privacy rules and the hospital policies for a minute. I'm a 6'8" man who just had a massive stroke. I just need to know one thing, and I need you to be honest with me. In the last 10 days, has anyone from my family, my son, his wife, has anyone even called this hospital to ask if I'm alive?" The question hung in the sterile air between us. For the first time, Dr. Evans' professional composure faltered. It was just for a second, a brief, almost invisible hesitation. Her eyes flickered away from mine for a heartbeat, and in that tiny moment, I got my answer. The knot of dread in my gut tightened into something cold and hard as a block of ice. She cleared her throat, her gaze returning to mine, now full of a carefully measured compassion. "Art, our focus here is on your health. Once you're a bit stronger, we'll make sure you have access to a phone so you can reach out to whomever you need to." Another wall, another polite, smiling obstacle. But her hesitation had told me everything. They hadn't called, they hadn't come. For 10 days, I had been lying in this bed, fighting for my life, and my son, the son I had just sent my roofing money to, hadn't even picked up the phone. The worry I'd felt for his safety curdled into a dark, ugly suspicion. This wasn't about a broken-down car or a busy work schedule. This was something else. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I wouldn't understand what it was until I had my own phone in my hand. It took another 2 days, days that felt like years, before they finally deemed me stable enough to be moved out of the ICU. The new room on the recovery floor was a small step up. It had a window that looked out over the hospital parking lot and the gray expanse of the bay beyond. But the change of scenery did nothing to quiet the storm in my mind. My single-minded mission, the one thing that kept me focused through the therapy sessions and the endless vital checks, was getting my hands on my phone. I asked every nurse, every orderly, every doctor who came into my room, my voice getting stronger and more insistent each time. My personal effects. I need my phone. I must have sounded like a broken record, a crazy old man obsessed with a piece of plastic and glass, but I didn't care. Finally, late that afternoon, Sarah, the kind nurse from the ICU, appeared in my doorway. She was holding a large, clear plastic bag with my name written on it in black marker. "Found them," she said with a warm smile. They were still logged down in the emergency department. Inside the bag were my worn leather wallet, my set of keys, and my simple, slightly outdated smartphone. When she handed it to me, the cool weight of it in my palm felt more real than anything I had experienced in the last 2 weeks. It was a lifeline to the world I'd been cut from, and I had a terrible, sinking feeling it was also the key to understanding why that world had abandoned me. I waited until evening. I waited until the dinner trays had been collected, the hallways had quieted down, and the soft glow of the television was the only light in my room. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, unsteady rhythm that I was sure the nurses could hear from their station down the hall. My hands trembled as I plugged the phone into the wall and waited for it to charge. I stared at the blank screen, my mind racing with 100 different scenarios, 100 last-ditch excuses for Kevin. Maybe his own phone was lost or stolen. Maybe he'd left dozens of voicemails that hadn't gone through. Maybe there was a terrible misunderstanding. I was clinging to the image of the son I had raised, not the cold stranger my gut was telling me he'd become. The battery icon turned green. It was time. With a shaky thumb, I scrolled to his contact and pressed the screen. The phone began to ring, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet of my room. 1 ring, 2 rings. My hope began to dwindle. He wasn't going to answer. Yeah? What is it? The voice on the other end was Kevin's. But it wasn't the voice I was expecting. There was no relief, no worry, no panic. It was flat, impatient, and annoyed, as if I'd interrupted him in the middle of something important. And behind his voice, what was that sound? It wasn't the quiet of a home or the hum of an office. It was music, a cheerful, bouncing rhythm from a steel drum band. There was laughter, the faint cry of seagulls, and a gentle, rhythmic shushing sound, waves washing up on a beach. My mind couldn't process the conflicting information. "Kevin? Son, is that you? Where are you?" I stammered, the words catching in my throat. There was an audible sigh on the other end. "Dad, I'm kind of busy. What's up?" "Busy? Kevin, I'm in the hospital. Port Blossom General. I had a stroke, son. A bad one. I've been here for almost 2 weeks." I said the words, expecting them to land like a bomb, to shatter the festive atmosphere on his end and replace it with horrified silence. Instead, there was just a pause. The steel drums continued their carefree tune. "A stroke?" "Wow," he said, his tone casual, almost bored. Then came the words that would be seared into my memory forever. "Well, don't be so dramatic, Dad. You're talking to me now, so you must be fine." The air left my lungs in a single silent gasp. Dramatic? I was lying in a hospital bed with wires taped to my chest, my entire left side feeling like a numb, useless appendage, and he called me dramatic. The sounds from his end suddenly made a terrible, sickening kind of sense. "Where are you, Kevin?" I asked again, my voice low and dangerously quiet. "I told you I'm busy. We're in the Bahamas," he said, the name of the place landing like a physical blow. "Jenna found this incredible last-minute deal online, all-inclusive. We just had to take it. That windfall you sent for the car came at the perfect time. We really, really needed to de-stress. My money, my roofing money. The money I'd sent because I thought they were in a bind, because I believed my son was in trouble. He had taken it, and while I was lying paralyzed on my garage floor, he had been booking a trip to paradise. While the machines in the ICU were breathing for me, he and Jenna were basking on a beach. The betrayal was so immense, so absolute, it felt like a second stroke was tearing through me. "Kevin," I started, but I didn't know what to say. "What do you say to that? What words exist for that level of callousness?" He didn't give me a chance to find them. "Listen, I gotta run," he said, his voice hurried now. "The bar is closing soon, and Jenna wants another pina colada. Besides, these international calls are costing a fortune. We'll talk when we get back next week, okay?" And then, before I could answer, before I could scream or curse or plead, the line went dead. I held the phone to my ear for a long time, listening to the dial tone. The cheerful ghost of the steel drum music seemed to echo in the sterile silence of my room. My gaze drifted to the heart monitor by my bed. The steady, calm beep, beep, beep from before was gone. It was now a frantic, high-pitched shriek as the machine tracked the violent, chaotic rhythm of my shattered heart. I looked at the empty visitor's chair in the corner. It was no longer a symbol of absence. It was an indictment, a verdict. In that moment, something inside me, something soft and forgiving that I had nurtured for 39 years, broke. And in its place, something cold, hard, and heavy began to form. Something that felt an awful lot like steel. The frantic shrieking of the heart monitor brought Sarah and another nurse running into the room, their faces etched with alarm. Art, what is it? Are you having chest pains?" Sarah asked, her hands already checking the wires on my chest. I couldn't answer. I was staring at the acoustic tile ceiling, but I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing a white sand beach, a turquoise ocean, and my son's smiling, indifferent face. I was hearing the cheerful beat of steel drums over the sound of my own heart, trying to hammer its way out of my chest. I vaguely registered them giving me something through my IV, a mild sedative that was supposed to calm the frantic electrical storm inside me. It calmed the machine, returning the monitor to a steady, rhythmic beep, but it couldn't touch the inferno raging in my soul. They eventually left, satisfied that I wasn't having another medical event, and dimmed the lights. But sleep was an impossible idea. Sleep was a luxury for men who weren't being actively haunted. I lay there in the semi-darkness, the only light coming from the soft green and orange glow of the machines that were tethered to me, and I let the memories come. The phone call hadn't just broken my heart. It had broken a dam that I had spent nearly 40 years building, and now a lifetime of carefully ignored truths came rushing in. It started with college. I remembered the pride I felt, so sharp it was almost painful, standing with Eleanor on the University of Maine campus, moving Kevin into his dorm room, a welder's son, going to college. We'd saved for 18 years for that day. We'd paid the first year's tuition in full from a dedicated account, money earned through countless overtime shifts and deferred vacations. Kevin lasted 2 semesters. He came home for the summer with a story about how the classes weren't creatively stimulating and he needed to find his real passion. He never went back. We lost thousands on the non-refundable fees, but the real loss was the hope we'd had. At the time, I told myself he was just young. Now, I saw it for what it was, the first time he'd walked away from something difficult, knowing I'd be there to absorb the cost. Then came the graphic design business. He was 25, living in our basement, and full of passion for a new career he'd learned about online. All he needed was the right equipment. He showed me a list of computers and software that cost more than my truck. "It's an investment in my future, Dad," he'd pleaded. Eleanor had been skeptical. "Has he shown you a business plan, Art? Any clients?" But I co-signed the loan. I wanted to believe in him. The business lasted for 6 months, producing nothing but a few logos for his friends' fantasy football teams before he announced he was burnt out and got a job delivering pizzas. The loan, however, lasted for 3 years. I paid every last cent of it myself. And then there was Jenna. When she came into the picture, the requests for money became more frequent, the emergencies more sophisticated. I remembered the frantic call a few years ago, the week before they were supposed to fly to Cancun for a friend's wedding. Jenna's purse had been stolen, with her wallet and all her credit cards inside. She was hysterical, Kevin said. They'd have to cancel the trip. He hated to ask, but could I maybe cover the spending money? I could hear Jenna crying theatrically in the background. I'd sent them $1,500. Eleanor, who was in her final months by then, had just shaken her head from her armchair. "A woman who can afford a trip to Cancun doesn't have just one credit card, Arthur," she'd whispered. "And people who respect what things cost don't lose them." Her words were a ghost in the room with me now, sharp and clear and devastatingly true. The memories kept coming, each one another brick in the wall of my own foolishness. The 4 months I'd paid their mortgage when Kevin was between jobs, draining my own retirement savings to keep them from foreclosure. The endless car repairs, the unexpected dental bills, the short-term loans that were never ever paid back. It wasn't a series of unfortunate events, it was a business model, a pattern of behavior that I had not only allowed, but actively funded. I wasn't his father, I was his safety net, his emergency fund, his enabler. I was the soft place he knew he could always land, no matter how high he flew or how recklessly he jumped. I finally understood. My love for my son hadn't helped him, it had crippled him. By shielding him from every consequence, I had robbed him of the chance to ever become a man. Eleanor's voice echoed in the quiet room, as clear as if she were sitting in the empty visitor's chair. A man who never feels his own weight will never learn to stand. I had been so determined to give my son a better, easier life than my own, that I had given him a worthless one. The grief I felt in that moment was staggering grief for my wife, whose wisdom I had ignored, and grief for the son I had lost not to a stroke in a hospital, but to my own blind, stupid weakness. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, the heartbreak inside me began to cool. The white-hot rage and the gut-wrenching sorrow had burned themselves out, and what was left was something new. It was the steel I'd felt forming earlier, now forged in the fires of a lifetime of regret and tempered in the cold waters of truth. It was a calm, absolute, and unshakable resolve. The bank of Dad was closed, the safety net was being taken down. The lessons my son had failed to learn for 39 years were about to begin. The tuition would be steep, and class was officially in session. I made a silent promise to the memory of my wife. I was finally going to teach our son how to stand on his own, even if I had to kick the ground out from under him to do it. That same morning, Dr. Evans came into my room with a clipboard, and what I'm sure she intended to be an encouraging smile, she was pleased with my progress. My vitals were strong, my speech was clear, and I'd even managed to shuffle the length of the hallway with a physical therapist. She was ready to discharge me. "Now, Art, I'm sending you home with a stack of prescriptions and a strict set of instructions," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Your body has been through a war, and the next month is critical. No strenuous activity, no lifting anything heavier than a carton of milk. You need to rest, focus on your physical therapy, and let your brain and body heal." I listened politely, nodding in all the right places. I took the prescriptions from her hand and folded them neatly, placing them in my shirt pocket. The old Art, the man who'd been brought here 2 weeks ago, would have been grateful, maybe a little overwhelmed. He would have promised to follow her orders to the letter. But that man was gone. I looked at her, my gaze steady, and said, "Thank you, doctor. You and your staff took good care of me." She seemed to notice the change in me, the absence of the confused fear that had clouded my eyes for days. A flicker of curiosity crossed her face, but she simply nodded. "Just take it easy, Art. Don't rush things." I had no intention of taking it easy. Rest was a luxury I couldn't afford. I had a new project to work on, one that required a different kind of strength. When the nurse came in with a wheelchair to take me to the front entrance, I waved her away. "I can manage," I said, and I walked out of that hospital on my own 2 feet. The automatic doors slid open, and the cool, salty air of Port Blossom filled my lungs. It felt like the first real breath I'd taken in my life. Everything looked the same, but I was seeing it through different eyes. The world looked sharper, clearer, stripped of the sentimental fog I'd been living in for decades. I got a taxi from the stand out front, but I didn't give the driver my home address. "Port Blossom Savings and Loan, on Main Street," I told him. He grunted, and we pulled away from the curb. At the bank, I walked past the line of tellers and went straight to the manager's office, a man I'd known since he was a kid. I didn't waste time with small talk. I needed a copy of the deed to my house, a statement confirming the property was free of any liens, and a full printout of my account activity for the past 5 years. He was clearly surprised by the strange, urgent request from a man who looked like he should be in a sickbed, but he did as I asked. I sat there, waiting, a sense of calm purpose settling over me. This was what I used to do at the shipyard: gather the blueprints, check the materials, and prepare the workspace before striking the first arc. This was no different. When I finally arrived home, the taxi pulling into the familiar gravel driveway, I saw the house not as my home but as an asset. The 30 years of memories, The ghosts of laughter in the living room and the scent of Eleanor's baking in the kitchen, they were all gone, burned away in the long dark night of my hospital stay. Now, it was just a building, a tool. The most powerful tool I had. Inside, I went straight to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room and rummaged through a drawer until I found what I was looking for. A worn, slightly bent business card for a local realtor, Carol Finney. She'd been a friend of Eleanor's. My hand was perfectly steady as I dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. Carol's Realty, this is Carol. Carol, it's Art Callahan. Art. Oh my goodness, I heard you were in the hospital. Are you all right? Her concern was genuine, a painful reminder of how real friends behave. I cut through the pleasantries. There was no time for them. I'm fine, Carol. Listen, I need your help. I need to sell my house. A stunned silence on the other end. Sell the house? Art, are you sure? Maybe you should take some time to... I'm sure, I interrupted, my voice as hard and cool as a fresh weld. And I need to do it fast. I'm not looking for top dollar. I'm looking for speed. I want a cash buyer, someone who can close the deal in a matter of days. No questions asked. Do you have anyone like that on your list? The silence stretched a bit longer as she processed the cold finality in my tone. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. This wasn't a grieving widower making a rash decision. This was something else. Yes, she said finally, her voice now cautious and professional. Yes, Art. I think I might. After I hung up the phone with Carol, a strange and profound silence settled over the house. It was the silence of a plan set in motion, of a final decision from which there was no retreat. Dr. Slapely Brevag's. Evan's orders to rest echoed in my mind, and I dismissed them with a cold finality. Rest was for healing. I wasn't healing. I was preparing for battle. I didn't unpack or try to settle in. Instead, I picked up a yellow legal pad and a pen and began to walk through the house, room by room. But I wasn't seeing it as my home anymore. I was seeing it through a buyer's eyes, with the cold, critical detachment of an inspector. The living room had scuff marks along the baseboards where the vacuum cleaner had hit one too many times. The guest bathroom faucet had a slow, rhythmic drip, drip, drip that I had tuned out years ago. A floorboard in the hallway leading to Kevin's old bedroom had a distinct squeak that I now found intolerable. My list grew with every step. I was cataloging not just cosmetic flaws, but years of my own passive neglect. Each item on the list was a small monument to the energy I'd spent worrying about Kevin's life instead of maintaining my own. By the time I was done, the page was filled with 24 tasks. This wasn't a home to me now, it was a job site. The next morning I started at dawn, ignoring the deep ache in my bones and the pins and needles sensation that still lingered in my left hand. I started with the dripping faucet. In my prime, it was a 10-minute job. Now it was an hour-long war. Lying on my back on the cold linoleum, the space under the sink felt like a coffin. My left arm, the weaker one, refused to cooperate, dropping the wrench twice with a deafening clatter. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and my head throbbed in time with the slow drip from the pipe. For a moment, lying there helpless and frustrated, I felt a flicker of the old vulnerability. Then I thought of the steel drums, of the casual cruelty in my son's voice, and the weakness was burned away by a clean, hot anger. I took a deep breath, repositioned my body, and put every ounce of my remaining strength into turning the wrench. It finally caught, and with a final, groaning turn, the dripping stopped. The sudden, complete silence was the most satisfying sound in the world. It wasn't just a leak I had stopped, it was a drain. From there, I worked like a man possessed. I spent the rest of the day with a putty knife and a can of spackle, meticulously filling every nail hole, every dent, every scar on the walls of the house. As I smoothed the white paste over the imperfections, it felt like I was smoothing over the cracks in my own life. Each stroke was an act of erasure. I was covering up the evidence of a life that was no longer mine. When I finished, I opened a can of paint, a neutral, impersonal beige that Eleanor would have hated, and I began to paint the walls, systematically eliminating the pale blue of our old bedroom, the sunny yellow of the kitchen. I was painting away the memories, creating a blank canvas, a sterile shell for strangers to inhabit. A sharp pain bloomed in my chest, a stern warning from my battered body. I had to sit down, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and swallow one of the pills Dr. Evans had prescribed. But as soon as the pain subsided into a dull ache, I was back on my feet, paintbrush in hand. The physical toll was immense. My body screamed in protest. Every muscle ached, my head pounded, and a constant, bone-deep exhaustion settled over me. But the physical pain was a strange gift. It was real, tangible, and it crowded out the emotional agony. It was an anesthetic. I cleaned out the garage, the sanctuary that had become the scene of my collapse. I found a box of Kevin's old things from high school yearbooks, a dusty tennis racket, a broken game console. I looked at it all for a moment, feeling nothing, not a flicker of nostalgia, and then I hauled it to the curb for the trash collectors. I mowed the lawn, the push mower feeling like it weighed a ton. I trimmed the hedges that lined the walkway, forcing them into sharp, clean lines. By the end of the third day, I was a wreck. My hands shook, my limp was more pronounced, and I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose. But the house was transformed. It was clean, orderly, and completely impersonal. It shone with a kind of anonymous perfection. I sat in Eleanor's old armchair in the living room, a room that no longer felt like ours, and surveyed my work. Every single repair, every hour of grueling labor, had been a conversation with myself. I wasn't just preparing a house for sale, I was deconstructing a life built on a faulty foundation. I was tearing it down to the studs so that something new, something stronger, could be built in its place. Carol called the next afternoon. "Art, I have someone," she said, her voice cautiously optimistic. "He's an investor from Boston, specializes in quick cash purchases for rental portfolios. He can see the property in an hour. His name is Mr. Sterling." The name sounded cold and expensive, and the man who arrived an hour later in a gleaming black BMW perfectly matched it. He was younger than me, probably in his late 40s, dressed in a sharply tailored suit that looked completely out of place in my quiet, working-class neighborhood. He gave my hand a brief, firm shake, but his eyes were already casing the joint, scanning my freshly painted walls and refinished floors, not with appreciation, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a predator sizing up its prey. The tour of the house was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't compliment a single thing. Instead, he made quiet, critical observations, just loud enough for me to hear. Original plumbing. That'll all have to be ripped out," he murmured in the bathroom, where I had spent an hour wrestling with the faucet. In the kitchen, he ran a gloved finger along the countertop. Formica, a full gut, job, obviously. He was systematically devaluing my life's work, turning every repair I'd just bled for into a liability. Each comment was a small, sharp jab, designed to make me feel desperate, to remind me that my home in his world was a teardown. Carol, to her credit, tried to highlight the positives, the new paint, the solid foundation, but he waved her off with an indifferent flick of his wrist. He was the physical embodiment of my son's worldview, a belief that nothing has any real value beyond its price tag, that everything and everyone can be bought if you just find their point of weakness. I stood by silently, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets, the steel in my soul being tested. I could feel the old Art wanting to apologize, to make excuses for my humble home. But the new Art just watched and waited. We ended up in the living room. He didn't sit, preferring to stand and loom. He pulled out a sleek tablet, tapped on it a few times, and then looked at me, a flicker of a predatory smile on his lips. "All right, Mr. Callahan, it's a decent lot, I'll give you that. But the structure needs a tremendous amount of work to get it up to modern rental standards. Given the capital investment required, and the fact that you're clearly motivated to sell quickly," he said, letting the words hang in the air, "my firm can offer you 60% of your asking price. We can have a cashier's check cut today." The number was so low, it was a slap in the face. It was a vulture's offer, designed to pick the bones clean. For one terrifying moment, a wave of pure panic washed over me. What if he's the only one? What if this is my only chance to see the plan through? My entire scheme, my son's great lesson, hinged on this transaction. Carol shot me a worried look, a silent expression that said, "This is a bad deal, but it's a deal." I looked at Mr. Sterling's smug, confident face. I thought of my son's voice on the phone, dripping with the same casual, dismissive arrogance, and I felt the steel inside me harden into a blade. "No," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Sterling's smile faltered. He was used to haggling, not outright rejection. "No? The answer is no. Thank you for your time, Mr. Sterling," I said, walking to the front door and holding it open for him. He stared at me for a second, his mind recalibrating, then he gave a slight shrug as if to say your loss, and walked out to his fancy car without another word. After he drove away, Carol let out a breath she seemed to have been holding the whole time. Art, that was a terrible offer, but are you sure? Cash buyers like that don't. Get me another one, Carol, I said. Get me a real one. She called the next morning, her voice hesitant. I have one other possibility, Art. He's not a big-shot investor. He's a local guy, a master carpenter named Ben Carter. He owns a few properties in the area. He can be there this afternoon. Oh, Ben Carter arrived in a dusty Ford Ranger, the kind of truck I'd owned my whole life. He was in his late 30s, with work boots on his feet and sawdust in his hair. His handshake was like my own firm, calloused and honest. His tour of the house was the polar opposite of Sterling's. He moved slowly, appreciatively. He ran his hand over the solid oak banister in the hallway. They don't make them like this anymore, he said, more to himself than to me. He noticed the new paint, the clean grout lines in the bathroom, the silence where a leaky faucet used to be. He was seeing the work, the care, the craftsmanship. He was speaking my language. When we were done, we sat at my small kitchen table. He didn't pull out a tablet. He just looked at me directly. It's a good, solid house, Mr. Callahan. You can tell it's been cared for. My offer is 90% of your asking price. I can pay cash, and my lawyer can have the paperwork drawn up to close by the end of the week. The offer was fair. It was respectful. It was a number that honored the work I had put into this place, both 30 years ago and 3 days ago. It was vindication. It was the proof that genuine quality is still worth something to people who know how to recognize it. Deal, I said, and a wave of relief so profound it almost made my knees buckle washed over me. I reached across the table and shook his hand. It was done. The hardest part was over. The welder's steel had held. The days that followed the handshake with Ben Carter were a blur of efficient, impersonal activity. Carol was true to her word, and it turned out Ben was the kind of man who did things the way he built things. Quickly, cleanly, and without any fuss. His lawyer, a man as straightforward as he was, had the paperwork moving at lightning speed. There were title searches, property disclosures, and closing statements to review. Each phone call from Carol, each document sent over for my review, made the plan more concrete, more real, and more terrifyingly irreversible. The closing was scheduled for Friday, just 3 days after I'd shaken Ben's hand at my kitchen table. It was to take place at the lawyer's office downtown. The night before, I slept in my own bed for the last time. I had expected to feel a wave of sadness or nostalgia, but I felt nothing of the sort. The house had already ceased to be my home. It was a property, a vessel I had prepared for a new captain. I felt only a quiet, grim anticipation, the same feeling I used to get at the shipyard just before lowering my welding mask, right before the fire and the noise were about to begin. The lawyer's office was on the second floor of a historic brick building on Main Street. It was an old-fashioned place, with dark wood paneling, shelves lined with thick, leather-bound books, and the quiet, dignified smell of old paper. It felt like a place where serious, unbreakable promises were made. Ben and Carol were already there when I arrived, and we all sat around a large, polished mahogany table. The lawyer, Mr. Blank, Davies, entered and placed a thick stack of documents in the center of the table with a soft, definitive thud. "All right, gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and professional. "Everything is in order. Art, these first pages are the final closing statements, and this last document here is the deed of sale." He pushed the stack towards me. I picked up the pen he offered, its weight heavy and cool in my hand. For one brief, heart-stopping moment, I hesitated. My eyes scanned the legal jargon, but what I saw were ghosts. I saw Eleanor planting rose bushes by the front porch. I saw a 5-year-old Kevin learning to ride his bike on the driveway. I saw 30 years of a life, a family, an entire history, all condensed into these few pages that would sign it all away. Was this justice, or was it just destruction? Then, as clear as if it were being piped through a speaker in the room, I heard it, the cheerful rhythm of steel drums, the casual, dismissive bite in Kevin's voice. "Don't be so dramatic, Dad." My hand, the one that had trembled so violently in the hospital, was now perfectly steady. The welder's steel, forged in the fires of betrayal, held firm. This wasn't an act of destruction. It was an act of survival. It was a controlled demolition, clearing the rotted foundation to make way for something new. I brought the pen to the first signature line and signed my name, Arthur Callahan. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the room. I moved through the pages, signing and initialing where I was told, each stroke of the pen a deliberate, final cut, severing the ties that had bound me to a life of thankless sacrifice. When I was done, I pushed the stack of papers back to the center of the table. Mr. Davies nodded, and Ben slid a pale blue cashier's check across the polished wood towards me. I picked it up. The number printed on it was substantial, but the amount was secondary. What mattered was what it represented. It wasn't a windfall, it was a reclamation. It was the total value of my life's work, converted into a form I could finally use for myself. It was the price of my freedom. We all shook hands, and it was over. I walked out of that quiet, wood-paneled office and back into the bright afternoon Sunday. The deed was done. The house, my home for 3 decades, was no longer mine. I was unmoored, adrift, and for the first time, it didn't feel like I was drowning. It felt like I was finally learning to float. With the cashier's check tucked safely in the inner pocket of my jacket, I walked away from the lawyer's office, not towards home, but in the opposite direction. My first stop was a branch of a completely different bank in the next town over. I opened a new account under my name only, depositing the entire sum and arranging for a new debit card and a book of checks to be mailed to a P.O. box I'd rented that morning. It was a clean financial break, a firewall against the life I was leaving behind. My next stop was on the industrial outskirts of town, a place of warehouses and chain-link fences called Portside Storage. The facility was a sprawling, anonymous grid of identical, roll-up metal doors painted a faded, cheerful orange. It was the perfect, soulless place to entomb a past. I walked into the office and paid for a 10 by 20-foot unit for 1 full year, in cash. The clerk, a bored teenager listening to music on his earbuds, barely looked up. He handed me a cylindrical lock still in its plastic packaging and a key, Unit Hasson Uni 3. There was no sentiment in the transaction, and that's exactly how I wanted it. The 48 hours I had left in the house were the most physically and emotionally grueling of my life. I had rented a small U-Haul truck and parked it in the driveway where my old Ford used to sit. Then, with the cold efficiency of a repo man, I began to pack my son's life into cardboard boxes. It was a strange and painful emotional autopsy. I started in the spare room they used when they stayed over. I packed Jenna's things first. Designer dresses with the price tags still on them, expensive skincare products barely used, a stack of glossy magazines with articles about manifesting abundance. It was the shallow archaeology of a life lived for appearances. Then I moved to Kevin's things, remnants of a life of half-hearted ambitions. There was a beautiful acoustic guitar I'd bought him for his 30th birthday, now thick with dust in the corner. He'd never learned to play past 3 chords. There were boxes of expensive electronics, old video game consoles, and notebooks filled with grandiose but half-finished business plans. As I taped up a box of their wedding photos, I paused on one of the happy couple. They were smiling, but their eyes were vacant. They looked like actors playing a part. I saw myself in the background of one shot, younger, heavier, smiling a genuine, hopeful smile, and I felt a profound and sorrowful disconnect from the man I used to be. I worked without stopping, fueled by black coffee and a grim sense of purpose. This wasn't packing, it was an exorcism. Each sealed box, each piece of tape, was a severing. It took 3 trips in the U-Haul. I stacked the boxes neatly inside the cold, concrete walls of Unit Hasson Uni 3. Their entire life, as they knew it, fit inside that 10 by 20-foot box. When the last box was unloaded, I stood for a moment in the sterile, windowless space, looking at the mountain of their possessions. Then I pulled down the heavy, corrugated metal door. The sound it made as it slammed against the concrete was deafeningly final. I slid the lock into place and clicked it shut. I had locked the door on their past and on my own. I returned to a completely empty house. The rooms echoed with every footstep, the ghosts of the past finally banished. The only things left were the kitchen table and a single chair, which I'd agreed to leave for the new owner. I sat down at that table, the place where Eleanor and I had paid bills, where we'd helped Kevin with his homework, where we'd had 1,000 quiet meals. The house was a hollow shell, and so was I. I took out the yellow legal pad and the pen. It was time to write the final entry in the ledger of my son's upbringing. My hand didn't shake. My thoughts were clear, sharp, and cold. I started writing. Kevin, By the time you read this, the house has been sold. The life you assumed was waiting for you here is gone. Your belongings are in storage unit, Hassonon 3, at Portside Storage on the Industrial Road. The key is taped to the back of this letter. I've paid the rent for 1 year. After that, it's up to you. For 39 years, I have been your safety net. I've come to realize that in doing so, I have failed you as a father. A father's job is to prepare his son for the world, and I prepared you for a world where consequences don't exist. That was my mistake. This is my attempt to finally correct it. Consider this a ledger, the final accounting of a debt you were never asked to repay. I have paid for a college education you abandoned. I have paid for a business you started and discarded. I have paid your mortgage to save this very house from foreclosure, a house you saw only as an inheritance. I have paid for your wife's luxuries and your shared vacations. And most recently, I paid for a trip to the Bahamas, which you took with my roofing money while I was unconscious in an ICU bed. You called my stroke dramatic. You told me you had to hang up because international calls are costing a fortune. You treated my potential death as an inconvenience to your holiday. You have taught me the true meaning of that word, inconvenience. And I have learned the lesson. This is not cruelty. This is the education I should have been giving you all along. This is the real world, where actions have consequences. There is no more money. There is no more house to borrow against. There is no more father to bail you out. You are 38 years old. It is time for you to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Your mother always said that a man who never feels his own weight can't learn to stand. Consider this me, finally letting go. Do not try to find me. Do not try to contact me. The man you knew is gone. I hope, for your sake, that one day a better man will take his place. I didn't sign it with Dad or love. I simply signed my name, Arthur Callahan. I folded the 2 pages, taped the small metal key to the back, and slid them into a plain white envelope. On the front, I wrote one word, Kevin. I propped it against the salt shaker in the exact center of the table. It was the only object in the entire empty house, a final, silent testament. Then, I stood up, walked to the front door, and pulled it shut behind me, the click of the latch echoing in the empty space. I did not look back. My new life began in a small, furnished apartment on the 3rd floor of a brick building in a town called Northport, 60 miles down the coast from the man I used to be. It was an anonymous place, with beige walls, generic furniture, and a window that looked out onto a quiet street I'd never seen before. It had no history, no memories, no ghosts. It was perfect. I'd spent the first 2 days in a state of quiet suspension, buying groceries, reading a book, and getting used to the new silences. I knew Kevin and Jenna were due back from their trip on Sunday. I knew what was coming. I was a man on the coast, watching the horizon for a hurricane I had summoned myself. Sunday afternoon, I was sitting at my small kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee. The apartment was peaceful. My old phone, the only relic I'd kept from my former life, was sitting face up on the table in front of me. At exactly 4:17 p.m., it vibrated, the buzz unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The screen lit up with a single word, Kevin. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel a pang of regret or a surge of anger. I simply watched it, a detached, clinical observer. The phone buzzed and vibrated for a full 30 seconds before falling silent, leaving a single missed call notification on the screen. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I imagined the scene clearly. Kevin and Jenna pulling into the old driveway, seeing the prominent sold sign staked into the front lawn. The first call was one of confusion. What's this prank, Dad? 10 minutes passed. At 4:27 p.m., the phone lit up again. Kevin, I let it ring. This call would be from the front porch, after finding their key didn't work. Annoyance would be creeping into his voice now. After it went to voicemail, a text message notification immediately popped up. I didn't read it, but I could see the first few words on the lock screen. Dad, what the hell is going on? Then, silence for a full 20 minutes. This was the crucial period. This was the time it would take them to find a way inside, maybe through the unlocked window I'd left in the back, and discover the empty house. The time it would take to walk through the echoing hollow rooms and find the single white envelope sitting in the center of the kitchen table. At 4:49 p.m., the storm broke. The phone began to vibrate and ring, and it didn't stop. It was relentless. Call after call after call. As soon as one would go to voicemail, another would immediately follow. The screen was a constant flashing beacon of my son's exploding world. I could practically hear his voice, progressing from indignant anger to pure, shrieking panic as the words on the pages of my letter sank in. The text messages started coming in a furious flood, one on top of the other, the notifications stacking up on the screen in a frantic, unreadable column. "You can't do this. Where is our stuff? I'm calling the police. You've been robbed. Dad, answer the damn phone." Then, a new number appeared. Jenna. Her calls were interspersed with Kevin's, a two-pronged assault of desperation. I imagined her alternating between screaming at Kevin and screaming into her phone. After a dozen of her calls went unanswered, the original barrage from my son resumed, now even more frantic, more unhinged. I sat there through it all, perfectly still, and calmly finished my coffee. There was no joy in this. There was no pleasure. I wasn't gloating over their pain. I felt only a profound and grim sense of justice, like a judge who has just passed a necessary but severe sentence. This was the consequence. This was the lesson. This was the feeling of a world without a safety net. This was the weight he had never been forced to feel, finally coming down on him all at once. After nearly an hour, the storm began to subside. The calls became less frequent, eventually sputtering out into a final, defeated buzz. The silence that returned to the apartment was deeper, more absolute than before. I picked up the phone. The screen was a testament to the meltdown. 82 missed calls, 47 text messages, 19 voicemails. I didn't block his number. I didn't delete the messages. I simply turned the phone over, placing it face down on the table. The frantic energy was spent. The fallout was contained. I stood up and walked to my new window, looking down at the unfamiliar street below. A family was walking by, laughing. The sun was getting low in the sky. The world was moving on. And for the first time since Eleanor had passed, I felt like I could too. The first snow of the season was starting to fall, the fat, wet flakes melting as they hit the dark waters of the Northport harbor. 3 months had passed since the storm of calls. 3 months since I had closed the door on Arthur Callahan of Port Blossom and had simply become Art, the quiet man in the third-floor apartment who took long walks by the sea. The phone had long since fallen silent. After that first day, there had been a few sporadic attempts, a handful of angry texts, a tearful voicemail from a number I didn't recognize that I deleted without listening to, and then nothing. The silence I had once dreaded had become my most cherished companion. I hadn't kept the apartment. It had served its purpose as a bunker, a place to hide from the fallout, but it wasn't a home. A few weeks ago, I found a small one-bedroom cottage for rent, tucked away on a quiet street with a clear view of the ocean. It was small, easy to manage, and it was mine. My days found a new rhythm, one dictated not by anxiety and obligation, but by simple, quiet purpose. 3 days a week, I'd walk down to the marina, to a large workshop that smelled of cedar shavings and varnish. I'd joined the Northport Maritime Heritage Society, a group of retired fishermen, carpenters, and tradesmen who spent their time restoring old wooden boats. I had my skills back. My hands, which had once felt so useless, were steady again. I'd spend hours sanding down the hull of an old peapod boat or carefully fitting a new piece of oak to a cracked rib. We didn't talk much, the other old men and me. We just worked, side by side, in a comfortable silence, each of us understanding that a man's worth could be found in the things he could build and the things he could fix. My old phone still sat in a drawer by my bed. I rarely turned it on. Its power over me was gone. It was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was just an object, a relic from a past that felt like it belonged to another man. I didn't know what had become of Kevin and Jenna, and I had come to the startling realization that I was okay with not knowing. I hoped he was learning to stand on his own. I truly did. But his life was his own to build or to ruin. My job as his architect, his financier, and his foundation was over. The greatest gift I had ever given him was the one he never wanted, the gift of his own life, free and clear of me. This evening, I finished my work at the shop and walked down to the end of the pier to watch the sunset. The snow had stopped, and the winter sky was a breathtaking canvas of pale pink and deep violet. The cold, clean air filled my lungs, and it felt like I was breathing for the first time. I thought of Eleanor, and for the first time, it wasn't with the pain of regret, but with a quiet, peaceful sense of knowing she would have understood, that she would have been proud of the man I had finally become. The lights of the town began to twinkle to life behind me. A fishing boat chugged its way back into the harbor, its engine a low, steady heartbeat in the growing twilight. I stood there for a long time, feeling the chill on my face, watching the last light fade from the sky, a free man in the quiet dignity of a life I had reclaimed.